Imagine you're high in the Great Smoky Mountains on a perfect Father's Day weekend. You're with your family at a sunny meadow campsite, and your 6-year-old son is playing hide and seek with his older brother and 2 other kids. And they're literally just feet away from you and other adults. The boys, they concocted a silly little plan. What they're going to do is they're going to duck behind a bush, wait for adults to pass by, then they're going to jump out and try to scare them. You sit there and you watch your son dart behind that bush with a huge smile on his face. He giggles, but that's the last time you see him. 1 second, he's right there, but the next, he's gone. Now, this is the case that still haunts parents 56 years later. We'll be going much deeper into every chilling detail as to what happened that day in just a few minutes. And we're going to be diving into 2 more stories that will send chills down your spine. Welcome back, listeners and watchers, to another dark and disturbing episode of Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and tonight we're stepping into one of the most chilling mysteries in modern history. We're going to be diving into some of the darkest missing 411 cases ever documented. 3 families who lived through some of the most unimaginable horrors that anybody should ever live through. The loss of loved ones with no real answer as to what happened. No bodies, no explanation, just impossible patterns that still haunt the national parks to this day. We're talking vanishings that break every single rule of search and rescue, witness accounts that will make your skin crawl, and questions that have never been answered. So, if you're new here, I want you to buckle up. But if you've been here before, you already know how deep this rabbit hole goes. And tonight, we are going all the way in. Because truth depends on where you're standing. And that is relative perspective. So, what exactly is missing 411? It's not just people getting lost in the woods. That happens almost every single day. This is something much different. It started with a former police officer by the name of David Paulides. He spent 20 years on the streets of San Jose, California. He's done narcotics, he was in SWAT, hell, he's pretty much done it all. Now, after he retired, he became really big into Bigfoot research. Now, I mention that because that's going to come into play a little bit later. Now, one day in 2008, he's at a law enforcement conference and he meets up with these off-duty park rangers, and they definitely tell him some weird stuff. They sit and talk to him for a while, and they basically tell him that there's some strange stuff that's going on in these parks, and they definitely don't make any sense at all. They say that there are people vanishing under rules of search and rescue that they have never ever seen. And Paulides, he did what any good detective would do. He started digging. He gathered FOIA requests, newspaper archives, police reports, ranger logs, pretty much anything he can get his hands on. What he found, it shocked him so much that he turned it into a book series. He's now got 12 books, 3 feature documentaries, and he's documented well over 1,400 cases that fit his profile. He basically made up his own internal code, and he called it Missing 411. Now, understand, not every missing person qualifies. Only the ones that hit a cluster of bizarre, repeating details that break every rule of conventional search and rescue. And here's what those patterns look like straight from his case files. Number 1, disappearances almost always happen in or near U.S. or Canadian national parks, national forests, or other wild national lands. And they form tight geographic clusters. And pattern number 2, many of the victims are very young children, many under the age of 10, or older experienced outdoorsmen. These are people who shouldn't just get lost. And then we have pattern number 3, they basically vanish in seconds. And it often happens when family is literally within shouting distance. One moment they're there, the next they're gone. There's no scream and there's no struggle. Now we have pattern number 4. We're going to be talking about the search dogs. Even the best bloodhounds, they can barely pick up a good scent trail. Sometimes they can't pick up one at all. Or they track to a spot and then they stop dead. It's almost like the person they evaporated. Now we got pattern number 5. It's bad weather, which usually rolls in within a couple hours of the person going missing. You got heavy rains, snow, or huge thunderstorms that erase any evidence of anything that was there. And then we have pattern number 6, when the bodies are found, and believe me, many of them are never found. They're found in places that have already been searched many, many times. Or they're found miles away in terrain that basically defies logic. Places like huge cliffs or swamps that are almost impossible to reach. And sometimes they're found with clothes that are removed or turned completely inside out. Then we have pattern number 7. Some victims are found with strange items in their mouth, like flowers or berries. And what's weird about this is they don't match the season or the area that they were found in. And finally, pattern number 8. In a handful of cases, people reappear alive days or weeks later. And not only that, some of them are found miles away in different clothes with no memory as to what happened to them. Now, understand, Politis, he's very, very careful about this. He said over and over that he's not trying to tell you what or who is doing this. He's just trying to show you the patterns that the government or the park services, they don't want to talk about. Now, he's accused the National Park Services of everything from incompetence to outright obstruction. Number 1, they don't keep a database of missing people. 2, they fight FOIA requests, and they've been known to close trails or shut down searches quicker than usually what's called for. And the theories that people have built around these patterns go from the downright wild to the more grounded. You've got Bigfoot or some kind of undiscovered hominid. Then you have interdimensional doorways, ancient beings from native legends, UFO-related abductions, even government black projects or time slips. And on the other end, we have explanations that feel a lot more earthly. But we're not going to litigate any of that just yet. Because when you take the 3 darkest cases that we're about to walk through tonight, the ones that check every single box on that list, and then some, the easy answers, they start to sound a lot less easy. Okay, let's start with one that still keeps parents up at night. The case that many people say is ground zero for the whole missing 411 conversation. Dennis Martin, June 14th, 1969. They're at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and it's Father's Day weekend. Bill Martin, his father, his grandfather Clyde, and a small group of family and friends are camping at Spence Field. This is a beautiful open meadow right on the Appalachian Trail. Dennis is a quiet 6-year-old kid. He's wearing a bright red shirt and some dark pants. Now, the reason why I bring up his red shirt is because that will definitely come into play later. Now, he's with his older brother Douglas and 2 other boys from their camping group, maybe about 20 or 30 yards away from all the adults. Now, they're out there messing around, playing around like kids do. Then they all decide that they're going to try to play a prank. Their plan is to hide behind a bush, wait for the adults to pass by, then they're going to jump out and scare them. Now, all the adults, including Bill, his father, and Clyde, his grandpa, they were sitting around this grassy area, and they were all watching the kids play. And in later accounts, Bill Martin said he personally saw the kids, his son, and those other boys that crouched down behind those bushes and, start their prank. He specifically last saw Dennis darting right behind this particular rhododendron bush. He said he saw a huge smile on Dennis's face. Dennis giggled, and that was the last time Dennis was seen. The other 3 boys, they did as planned. They jumped out, but Dennis, he didn't. Now, there's only 15 to 30 seconds had passed before Bill had immediately realized that something was definitely wrong. He first started calmly calling his son's name, and he didn't hear anything. Then he started screaming for him. And then he ran straight to the exact spot where he last saw Dennis hide. 1 second, Dennis was right there. The next second, he was gone. There was no cry, no rustle, and no footprints in that soft earth. His father had searched that exact spot where he saw his son duck behind that bush, but he didn't find a thing. Now, by late afternoon, the park rangers had showed up, and by nightfall, that's when the thunderstorm hits. They had 2.5 inches that accumulated over a few hours. But the search, it didn't wait. This became the largest search in the history of the entire National Park Services. There was over 1,400 people that joined in on the search. You had rangers, volunteers, hell, you even had Green Beret. Not only that, they had well-trained bloodhounds, and they even brought out helicopters with infrared. They combed 56 square miles, grid by grid, and inch by inch. Now, the crazy part about this story is, remember we spoke about those highly trained dogs, they didn't pick up a thing. Not one single scent trail leaving that bush. Now, days, they slowly turned into weeks, and still nothing. Then comes a detail that makes this case refuse to die. On the very same afternoon that Dennis vanished, the same day, the same park, a family named the Keys were hiking about 7 miles away at a place called Rowan's Creek. Harold, his wife, and his kids said that they heard an enormous, sickening scream. A sound that Harold later described as unnatural and something that he will never forget. And minutes later, after they heard the scream, they said that they saw this weird-looking man. They said he just didn't look right. He was like rough and shaggy. He almost looked animalistic. And they said that he was hauling butt through that brush. And weirder still, over his shoulder, he was carrying something that looked red. They said that it looked like either cloth or clothing. Now, Harold, he didn't know about the missing boy at this time. And he had only reported it days later whenever he heard the news. Now, he reported it to the Rangers, and the Rangers and FBI, they investigated it, but they felt like there was no connection because it was so far away. And the crazy thing is, to this day, that story, it's never been explained. The search, it went on for weeks. Now, they found almost nothing until one day, searchers, they came up on this shoe that matched Dennis's size. And the crazy thing is, the shoe was found in this area that had been swept multiple times. The shoe, it was perfectly placed, almost like it was set there on purpose. There was no body, no other clothing, no blood. There was nothing. Dennis Martin, he was never found. Now, let's lay the missing 411 checklist over this story, because it hits every single box. First, you had a child under 10. He vanished in seconds with inside a family. The dogs picked up 0 scent even before the storm. Sudden and violent weather right after he went missing. A massive search that failed completely. Belongings appeared in previously searched areas. That chilling sighting of that shaggy man. And the one that hits the hardest for any parent listening right now. This was just supposed to be a happy Father's Day hike. A little boy playing a silly prank with his dad and grandpa sitting right there. Bill Martin had watched his son duck behind that rhododendron bush, and then suddenly, he was gone. Now, I know this is hard, but imagine that this was your son, or your nephew, or a kid that you had seen grow up. What would you tell yourself when the official answer is, we don't know? Would you accept that a 6-year-old just simply evaporated right there in front of his family? Would you sleep at night knowing that something out there, rough and shaggy looking, was seen carrying something red on that very same afternoon? That's the perspective of Dennis Martin. That's why this case became the spark for so many of us that can't stop digging. And this is just the first one. This next case, it's even more disturbing. And we'll definitely get there in a moment. But first, I want you to take a breath. Because these woods, they're not done with us just yet. Okay, believe it or not, this next case is even more disturbing than the last one. The worst day of Alan Adadero's life happened on October 2nd of 1999 in the rugged Poudre Canyon area of Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. 3-year-old Jared Atadero vanished in broad daylight. Jared, he was staying there with his father and his 6-year-old sister Jocelyn at a place called Poudre River Resort. It was a place owned by Alan and a close friend. Now, on that day, Alan had been invited to let his daughter Jocelyn join this Christian singles group on a day outing. A couple of people from the group told Alan that they were just planning to take Jocelyn to this local fish hatchery for just a safe day of fun. And of course, once Jared found out what was going on, he felt left out. And he begged his father if he could join in the fun with his sister. Now, Alan, of course, he was hesitant. Like I said before, Jared, he was only 3 years old, but Jared begged, and Alan, he agreed to let him go. Alan trusted the people in that group to keep their word and watch his kids as close as they possibly could. Now, as you can imagine, little Jared, he was so excited that Alan could barely get him dressed before Jared had shot out that front door. He was wearing a beige jacket, blue pull-up pants, and his favorite sneakers, which he left untied. Pretty much like any other 3-year-old boy, he just didn't see the need to tie them. Now, later on, the group headed out with Jocelyn and Jared, but instead of staying at the fish hatchery, they decided on an afternoon hike up a place called the Big South Trail. This place was a narrow, well-marked, increasingly steep path in rugged mountain terrain. Now, they finally got to their destination and they started hiking up the trail. And as time went on, the group, it started breaking up into smaller groups. The slower ones, fell back, and the faster ones, of course, went ahead. And as you can imagine, Jared ended up with the faster group because all he wanted to do was run and play, and he was full steam ahead. Then it didn't take him long. He actually pulled ahead of the adults about 50 or 60 yards. And while he was running around and playing, Jared actually ran into 2 more adults. They were fishermen. Now, according to the 2 men, he was just playing around and asking questions. One of the men, in later accounts, even said that Jared had asked if there were bears in the area. Now, when they were finished with their conversation, they saw Jared rapidly walk further up the trail. And they noticed the other group of hikers about 50 to 80 feet behind Jared, so they assumed that he was safe and he was with that group. They thought that nothing was wrong, only to later find out, sadly, that they were the last 2 people to see Jared alive. One moment, the adults could hear him. The next, it was completely silent. They called his name. They ran ahead in hopes that they would find him around the next bend, but that trail was empty. Jared Atadero was gone in broad daylight in front of multiple witnesses. There was no scream, no cry for help, no snapped twigs, and there was no physical sign that he had ever been there. Now, the group, they continued looking for Alan, but a few people broke away to, go 15 miles down the road to Alan's resort and let him know that his only son was missing. Alan did what any normal father would do after being told some of the scariest words that you can ever imagine, that your son is missing. He jumped up, he got in his truck, and he drove as fast as he possibly could to where his son was last seen. And when he got there, he frantically searched the last spot that they saw Jared alive, hoping against hope that he would find his son. Now, not long after that, the search was immediate and massive. They had hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, helicopters, thermal imaging. They had the whole works. Now, while they were searching, the dogs, it picked up 0 scent leaving that path. Then, like before, the weather turned vicious. It had heavy, heavy rain and strong wind. This was the kind of weather that scrubs the earth clean. And just like the majority of these horrific stories, after a short time, 8 days to be exact, the search, it was called off with no sign of little Jared Atadero. 4 long, agonizing years had passed. 4 years of Alan walking those same trails, calling out his son's name into the void. He was refusing to let that force win. Then on May 6th of 2003, you had 2 hikers by the name of Rob Osborne and Gareth Watts. They were the two men that made the discovery that still haunts everyone who hears it. Hundreds of feet, 550 to be exact, straight up a near vertical exposed ledge in terrain that was so steep that even seasoned climbers would hesitate to go up, much less a 3-year-old toddler. And this area had been searched multiple times before. Helicopters had flown directly over it, ground teams had walked beneath it, and none of them saw anything. There, the two hikers, they found Jared's brown jacket, and they said that it was mostly intact and they didn't see any sign of an animal attack. They found his blue sweatpants, and they were turned completely inside out, and there was one leg that was almost entirely shredded and missing. And not only that, they found Jared's favorite sneakers. They were pristine, barely scuffed, and the laces were still untied, exactly the way that Jared liked them. There was no drag marks, no blood, no dirt that would come from being hauled up a cliff by an animal, and nearby, in a crevice lit by one single shaft of sunlight, was a large fractured piece of skull. This was the top of Jared's cranium, and they also found one of Jared's molars. Now, they later tested the cranium and the molar, and this was definitely 100% Jared. Here's where the darkness, it truly swallows every rational explanation. I have never heard of a predator turning a child's clothes inside out. And no mountain lion gently removes shoes without destroying them, then drag a body 500 feet straight up this sheer cliff without leaving a single scrape or blood trail, or without leaving a single trace of its existence on the clothing or the remains. Now, the missing 411 checklist on Jared, it is merciless. Let's go ahead and line it up and see what we got. You have a child under 10. He vanished in seconds within visual range of adults. The dogs found 0 scent. There was sudden, violent weather right after. Remains in a previously searched, almost physically impossible location. His clothing was removed and turned completely inside out. And the whole scene was arranged like an offering or a warning. To me, this wasn't a random tragedy. This felt deliberate. Something reached down, took a laughing 3-year-old boy off of a sunny trail after talking to 2 adults, carried him to a place that even seasoned hikers have trouble reaching. They turned his clothes inside out, left his shoes almost untouched, and they left just enough behind to make sure that we would never stop asking questions. This case, it doesn't just break the rules. It mocks them with cold and surgical precision. Almost like whatever was in those woods wanted us to know that it was there. And it plays by no rules that we will ever understand. Now, Alan Atadero, he continued searching for answers and continued speaking out about his son's case for the rest of his life, until his own unexpected death in April of 2025 at the age of 67. Now, this is the part of the story that I hate, because I can't tell these stories without imagining, what if that was my son that got lost in that trail? What if I trusted a group of adults to keep their word and only take him to the one place that they didn't visit and then allow him to wander off alone? What if I had to live with the reluctant decision to allow my son to go with them in the first place? And sadly, that is Alan Atadero's perspective. No parent should ever have to live through this nightmare. Now, as terrible as Jared's story is, the next case that we're going to walk through tonight hits in a completely different way. Because this one, it didn't happen to a child that vanished forever. This one happened to a grown man who actually went into the woods, but he came back. And he came back forever changed. He's carrying memories of something that looked at him like he was livestock, decided that he was defective, and dropped him back on Earth like he was damaged goods. That's where we're heading next. And yet, as dark as Jared's story is, the third and final case that we're going to walk through tonight feels even closer to home to most listeners. Because this one, it didn't happen to a child. This one happened to a grown man that went into the woods with a rifle, and he came out remembering every single thing that happened to him. On October 25th in 1974, in Medicine Bow National Forest in southern Wyoming, A guy by the name of Carl Higdon, he was 41 years old, an oil field worker, a father of 7, a no-nonsense outdoorsman, and he was headed out alone to hunt for elk. Now, he wasn't out there long before he spots they're huge, 5 elk standing in this clearing. He raises his rifle, he squeezes the trigger, and strangely, there's no bang or recoil. He said that the bullet, it left the barrel in slow motion, almost like it was traveling through water. Then he said it slammed right into something invisible, and it drops harmlessly to the ground just yards away. He walks over, he picks it up, and sees that it's crushed and deformed, almost like it slammed into steel. He slips it into his pocket, then he looks up, and that's when he sees this strange figure appear. He looked over at him, and he said this thing was floating just, like a few inches off the ground. He was 6 foot tall. He was wearing a black jumpsuit with a yellow, star emblem on. He had like an apron around his waist, and that's where that star emblem was. Then he said he had yellowish skin, bristle-like hair, and he had 2 antennae on his head. Then he said he looked down at this thing's hands, and he said the right hand, it looked like a cone, but the left hand, it was missing. He didn't have a left hand. Now, the being, it began speaking to Carl, but his mouth wasn't moving. It was speaking to him telepathically. He told Carl that his name was Oso. It then proceeded to ask him a few more questions before offering Carl 4 pills. And for some unknown reason, Carl, he decides to swallow some. And not long after that, he said that his body, it felt completely different. Later, Oso invites him into this transparent cube-shaped craft. That's actually what Carl said that he shot. And after Carl says yes, the next thing he knows, he's sitting in that craft. The main thing that stuck out to Carl was that the craft, it looked a lot bigger from the inside. And he also looked behind him, and he noticed that he saw those 5 elk that he saw earlier still standing motionless in this cage. He even made the comment to Oso that they took his elk, but Oso, he didn't seem like he cared much. Now, after only a few seconds, the craft, it begins to lift, and Carl, he begins to drift off to sleep, I imagine from those dang pills he swallowed. Next thing Carl knows, he's light years away, and he's on Oso's home planet. He said that the air was thin, the landscape was harsh, and the beings there were hideously mutated. They showed him around for a while before they decided to examine him. Then comes the moment that still sends chills down my spine every time I read it. After the examination, Oso, he tells him telepathically that Carl is not what they need. Carl said that they were looking for viable genetic material, or breeding stock, like specimens that they could use. But Carl, he had a vasectomy after his 7th child. He was sterilized, and he was useless to them. So they sent him back. They dropped him in that same national forest hours later. He was disoriented, but he realized he found his truck, but he realized that it had been moved, and his family and friends, they had already started searching for him. Carl, he was found wondering, confused, but luckily he was alive. And he still had that bullet in his pocket for proof. Now, under hypnosis, years later, every detail that Carl said that day, it held up. He even took a polygraph, and of course he passed that too. He never wavered until the day he died. Now, let's lay the missing 411 pattern on top of this one. Because even though Carl came back, it still checks off a lot of those boxes. You have an experienced hunter in a national forest. He vanished in broad daylight. There was strange time distortion. He was returned, but he was brought to a different location and in a different mental state. And the high strangeness element that Paulides himself spotlights in his own UFO documentary. There was direct contact, an abduction, a medical examination, then he was rejected and returned. But here's the perspective that hits different when it's an adult. I want you to imagine that you're Carl. You go out for elk like you've done many, many times before. You look down the barrel, you squeeze that trigger one time, and then your reality, it cracks open. Then you're standing in front of something that looks at you like you're livestock. It reaches inside your mind, inside your body, and then it decides that you're defective. Then it drops you back on Earth like you're a bad cut of meat. What do you tell your wife, your kids, or your coworkers? Do you keep hunting? Do you ever walk in the woods again without wondering that if the next shadow is just a tree? Or you might think it's Oso coming back for a second look. This was Carl's perspective. He lived with it. He told this story straight with no embellishment for the rest of his life. And that, my friends, is why this case is still considered one of the darkest in missing 411 history. Because it's not just someone disappeared. It's someone that came back and wished that they couldn't remember a thing as to what happened to them. Okay, we've now walked through some of the darkest cases on record. 2 children who never came home, and 1 man that did, and he was carrying memories that no man should carry. So, what do we do with all this? That's exactly what we're going to unpack next. We've walked through 3 of the darkest cases on record. First, you had Dennis Martin taken in seconds while his father and grandfather stood just yards away. Then you had Jared Adadero, his tiny remains arranged like an offering, placed on a ledge that mocks physics. Then lastly, you have Carl Higdon, a grown man who came back remembering the exact moment that something came down and looked at him like livestock, and then sent him home like he was defective. So, what do we do with all this? Where do we even begin to wrap our minds around patterns that refuse every normal explanation? This is where the rabbit hole, it doesn't just open, it swallows you whole. The theories that people have built around these cases and around missing 411 as a whole range from the ancient and terrifying to the coldly technological to the outright cosmic. And every single one of them finds a perfect eerie home in at least one of tonight's 3 stories. Now, before we get started, I want you guys to remember that these are just theories that people have come up with over the years. And I'm not saying that any of these are true, but they are still a part of the missing 411 lore. First, the one that refuses to die no matter how many times it gets laughed at. The first theory that we're talking about tonight is Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or the wild man of the woods. And Dennis Martin's case is practically Exhibit A. That rough, shaggy-looking man that Harold Key saw rushing through the brush while carrying something red draped over his shoulders. And it was on the exact same afternoon just miles away. Key, he described it as human-like, but wrong. He said it was too fast, too stealthy, and too primal. And I also want you to remember that the dogs, they found nothing, not one scent trail. If something huge and intelligent was moving through that terrain, it would know exactly how to break a scent. Politis himself has documented dozens of hairy hominid sightings clustered right around missing 411 disappearances. Now, for Jared, how else does a 3-year-old find itself 550 feet up a sheer cliff with no sign, no blood trail, and his clothes turned inside out? Some people believe that this was a creature strong enough to carry a child that far, smart enough to stage the remains, and fast enough to avoid every searcher. This thing, it fits the profile of the wood ape that native tribes have warned us about for centuries. Now, the next theory that we talk about tonight, it goes much deeper. You have interdimensional portals or time slips. Ancient stories from almost every culture that lived in those mountains, like the Cherokee, the Ute, the Shoshone, even early European settlers. They talk about doorways and rocks, weird circular formations, and sudden mists that swallow people without a trace. Dennis, he vanishes behind a single bush in perfect weather. And just like that, a huge storm hits minutes later, almost like a doorway that sealed itself. And then you had Jared on a straight open trail, and 4 years later, they find parts of him that defies every rule of search and rescue. Now, you have some researchers that tie this to Skinwalker Ranch type phenomenon. These are places where the veil is thin and all the rules tend to break. Now, the next theory that we get to is the one that lights up every single conspiracy board: extraterrestrial abduction and genetic harvesting. Carl Higdon is definitely the smoking gun on this one. You have the transparent cubed craft, then you have the telepathic voice, then the explicit rejection because of his vasectomy. They straight up told him that he was not viable genetic material. Now, I want you to think about it like this. Paulides, he dedicated an entire documentary to the UFO connection in Missing 411 for a reason. Now, Carl's story, it's not the only one that leaves a trail. The kids, they do too. You have multiple 411 cases, including clusters right around Dennis and Jared, that have reports of strange lights or orbs right before or after a vanishing. Now, I'm not saying that that's proof, but it sure is kind of crazy. Okay, the next theories that we're going to talk about are even darker still. You've got government black projects and underground bases. You have to ask yourself, what if these aren't random? First, you have the Park Service's refusal to keep a central missing persons database. Then you have the weird way that some searches get shut down, or the way that some trails quietly get closed while people are still searching. Then you have the Green Beret and the infrared helicopters on Dennis's case. They didn't turn up anything. Now, some researchers point to deep underground military bases rumored under places like Yosemite and the Great Smokies. And the darker side of these theories, there's people that actually believe that the government does like weird human experimentation, things like MK Ultra style memory wipes and much worse. Now, Carl, he remembered everything, but there's a lot of missing 411 stories where people, they don't remember a thing. And then there are the theories that feel oldest and coldest. You have demonic or malevolent supernatural entities. In a way, some of these vanishings, they feel personal. You have a father and son prank turned nightmare, a laughing toddler taken from a church group, and then you have a family man that was rejected like he was spoiled meat. Now, you have some theorists that point to the fact that some of these 411 cases, their sites, they sit on ancient burial grounds or what they call ley lines. Another weird thing to look at is how some of the remains are sometimes found with strange items in their mouth. You have things like berries that are out of season or that aren't even from that area, almost like offerings accepted or refused. Now, that's not all. There are even hybrid theories. First, you have Bigfoot as an interdimensional guardian, and then you have aliens possibly using these creatures as scouts. And some of these theorists believe that the government knows exactly what's happening, but they're just managing the narrative. Every single theory that we've walked through tonight, it finds its strongest hold in these three stories that we told. Dennis, he gives us the witness and the impossible search. Then Jared, he gives us the mocking, almost impossible placement. And then you have Carl that gives us the conscious and the genetic rejection. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. None of these stories are mutually exclusive. What if the thing in the woods is possibly all of them at once? Something ancient, something technological, something that has always been here watching us while we pretend that the forests are safe. Okay, we've gone as deep as the patterns will take us on the what if side. But there's another voice that demands to be heard. The skeptics that say all of this is just tragedy draped in mystery. That's exactly where we're going to be heading next. Because before we land on my own perspective, we have to give the other side a voice. And trust me, they have some very pointed things to say about these three cases. Okay, let's jump into what the skeptics have to say. Tonight, we give both sides their full, uninterrupted hearing. There's going to be no cherry picking and no gotchas, just the strongest arguments that both sides bring to the table. Let's go ahead and start with the skeptics. They tend to come at this with one core message. They say to stop turning normal wilderness tragedy into conspiracy. The woods, they're definitely dangerous. People die in them every single year. And most of the time, the explanation is heartbreakingly ordinary. Here's the big picture that the skeptics like to point out. They say that Paulides selects only the creepiest stories. He tends to leave out inconvenient facts. And then they say that he acts shocked when the pattern, it looks impossible. Then they say that there's no central missing persons database in these parks because the National Park Service, it's not a law enforcement agency. All they tend to take care of is land management. And they have millions of visitors annually. They say that statistically, weird things, they're going to cluster. They say that rain washes scent. Animals, they drag bodies. Kids, they tend to always wander. And adults, they have heart attacks or slips. Then they bring up the no scent thing about the bloodhounds. They claim that these dogs, they fail all the time in rough terrain. Then they bring up the weather topic. They say that mountainous areas, they make their own weather. It's nothing suspicious at all. Now, they get really specific on these three cases that we discussed tonight. First, they talk about Dennis Martin. They say he's a healthy 6-year-old boy who decided to play hide and seek and just kept walking. Some of the claims were that searchers actually did find small footprints, and they said that they were heading downhill toward a creek. The Smokies, they're full of deep drops, thick brush, and fast-moving water. They say a child that size could fall, get swept downstream, and never be seen again. Then they bring up the Keys account about the shaggy man carrying that whatever was over his shoulder that was red. They said that it could have been a hiker, a hunter, or any unrelated person. Then they discussed the single shoe that was found later. They claimed that it was probably overlooked by that first sweep, or it was placed there by an animal. There's no mystery, just a tragic lost child case. And it got blown up because the search was so massive and, of course, emotional. Then they discussed Jared Adadero's story. They say that wildlife experts, including certain biologists, say that this matches a textbook mountain lion kill almost perfectly. Big cats, they drag prey high up on the ledges so they can eat safely. Then they discuss the pants and jacket that were pulled inside out. They claim that could very easily happen when an animal pulls a body through brush. Then they talk about the skull fragment. They say that scavengers, they scatter bones. That's nothing new. Now, I believe that they do understand that Alan's pain, it's real. But their official conclusion, it falls in line with Parks and Wildlife. They said that it was a mountain lion, plain and simple. Next, they talk about Carl Higdon. This one, they don't even treat as a disappearance mystery. They tend to treat it as almost like a 1970s-style tall tale. Classic alien abduction narrative that matches dozens of others from that era. Then they discussed the deformed bullet that Harold had in his pocket. They said that it could be a misfire, a reload gone wrong, or simple exaggeration after the fact. Then they dig into the polygraph and hypnosis. They claim that it is definitely not reliable science. People, they can create vivid false memories under hypnosis. There's no physical evidence beyond his word, no crafted debris, and there were no other witnesses to that invisible cube or the trip he took. Skeptics say that grief, stress, or something psychological could be the cause for everything that Carl thought that he saw. And they say that Paulides using this story as UFO connection proof is exactly the kind of stretch that people accuse him of. Taking one man's unprovable story and gluing it into missing persons cases. Then we have the skeptics' closing punch. Some of them claim that Paulides has been caught leaving out key details in multiple cases. They claim that sometimes he would inflate numbers and he would refuse to engage with critics that asked for raw data. They say that it's not a cover-up. It's just human beings underestimating nature. Now let's give the believers a turn. And believe me, they hit back just as hard. They say, okay, explain why many of these cases hit multiple weird factors at once. Not just one or two, but almost, if not all, of that checklist. First, we have Dennis. The footprints that the skeptics mentioned earlier, the family and some searchers later dispute that they didn't even believe that those footprints were even Dennis's. Then the shaggy man, he was reported the same afternoon. And this was before the Key family knew anything about Dennis being abducted or missing. To me, the witness, he had no reason to invent that story. Then you have the shoe that was later found in a already swept area. That's happened in way too many of these 411 cases to dismiss. Then you have the dogs failing to get a scent, huge search parties finding not one thing, and everything else in between. That's not normal lost kids statistics. Now we go to Jared. They say that mountain lions, they don't turn clothes inside out and leave shoes untouched. Then they discuss the skull fragment that was found 4 years later that was found on almost an impossible place to get to. Allen claimed to read almost every expert report, and he said that it didn't match any mountain lion cache that he had ever seen. Then they say that a 3-year-old, he doesn't just vanish on an open trail without sound. Not unless something took him fast and clean. Now, let's get into what they say about Carl. He never changed his story in 40 years. He passed multiple polygraph tests. His hypnosis sessions, they held consistent. And that bullet that he kept, it was examined, and they said that it was deformed in a way that ballistic experts, they couldn't redo. And there's something else that I failed to mention earlier. It was said that Carl had scarring all over his lungs from TB when he was younger. And when the doctors, they examined him in the hospital after he returned, they found no trace of scarring on his lungs. And believers, they also point out that if it was just a hallucination, why do so many other 411 missing cases have things like lights, orbs, time loss, or strange craft reports right around the time of vanishing? And they point to another topic as well. The Park Service, it tends to fight FOIA requests, and then they claim that searches are shut down unusually fast. Now, a lot of these skeptics, they tend to forget about the native tribes, and they've warned us for centuries about the ones who take people in these exact areas. Now, when you stack these cases, I'm not talking about cherry picking, but actually stack these cases, the odds of all these coincidences, that they become astronomical. Now let's get into the emotional truth. Families who lived it say that the official explanation, it feels insulting. They were the ones that were there. They saw the dogs fail, they saw the impossible locations, and they know more than anybody what they lost. So, now we've given both sides their time in the sun. Both are definitely very passionate, and both are able to point out real evidence and real holes in the other's perspective. The skeptics say that it's all selection bias and human error. Then the believers say that the patterns, they're too consistent and too defiant to be coincidence. And somewhere in the middle is where we have to decide for ourselves. That's the debate. That is the knife's edge that these cases, they sit on. And now it's time for my own perspective. What I think really happened or is still happening in those woods. And we're going there right now. Okay, guys, I know we've gone through a lot tonight. You had 3 families. You had 2 children and 1 father who stepped into the woods. 2, they never came back, and 1, he didn't come back the same. I've sat with these stories for a while now. I've done as much research as I could in the time that I've had, and here's my honest perspective. The one that lives in my chest when the lights go out and my house finally gets quiet. I don't believe that these are just random tragedies. The patterns, they're too consistent, too defiant, and way too intelligent. The way these kids vanish in seconds right in front of their family, the way that dogs go blind to scent, the way that remains show up in places that laugh at physics, a way that a grown man claimed that he went to space, and he came back with a memory that no one should have to carry. It sounds to me like something is definitely happening in these wild places. Something that has been happening for a very, very long time. And this is definitely something that doesn't play by our rules. Now, am I saying that each of these cases are Bigfoot, portals, or aliens with a breeding program? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Some of them are probably exactly what the skeptics say. Things like slips, falls, animals, bad luck, or just human error. One thing that I know is nature, it's definitely brutal, and it doesn't owe us any answers. But when you stack all of these cases together, the easy answers, they start to feel like we're insulting these families. We're telling grieving parents and a man who lived with those memories for decades that they're just mistaken and that their pain is just ordinary. And I can't do that. That's just not me. Not after looking at the evidence with open eyes. My truth, the one that I land on after everything, is this right here. The forest, they're older than we are. They hold things that we haven't named yet. Some of them, they might be ancient. Some of them might be visitors. And some might be something that we have never ever thought of. And every once in a while, one of them reaches out and it takes what it wants. Or maybe it's just testing us. Whatever it is, I believe that we owe these families the respect in saying, we see you, we hear you, and we're definitely not going to look away. Because the truth, it's uncomfortable, and that's one of the reasons why I do this show. And that's one of the main reasons why I call it relative perspective. Because like I said in the beginning, the truth, it really does depend on where you're standing. If you're the parent that watched your child disappear behind that bush, if you're the searcher that walked under that ledge 100 times, or if you're a hunter that still carries those dark memories, that perspective, it changes everything. So tonight, if you're listening, I want you to do me a favor. If you have kids, maybe go hug them a little tighter. And if you're planning on going for a hike soon, maybe tell someone where you're going. And if you ever hear that sudden unnatural silence in the woods, maybe listen. Because sometimes the forest isn't quiet because nothing's there. Sometimes it's quiet because something is there, but it's waiting for us to make the first mistake. Okay, guys, we made it. I know that was dark. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me all the way through this. I know it was tough. These episodes, they're long and they're heavy. And the fact that you sat with me in the dark and went all the way in, that really means everything to me. Now, if you're still here, I want you to do me a favor, hit the like button. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a weekly upload. And if you've got your own crazy, unexplainable, unnatural story, I definitely want to hear it. All you have to do is email me at relativeperspective76@gmail.com. Who knows, maybe we'll be able to share it on a future episode if you allow us. I want to thank you again for watching. You've been listening to Relative Perspective. And as always, I'm your host, Stephen. God bless you. We love you. And have a good night. Okay, Rosie, you want to go out? You want to go outside? Come on. Come on, Jimmy, you want to go outside? Come on. Come on, go to people. Come on, up. Hey, go outside there, Jimmy. Okay, I got to take my dogs out. Love you, bye.